Hello and welcome to sorry, stumbling over words already, and that's not good. Welcome to Tales from the Dragon's Library. My name is Trevor, also known as Xamot on my gaming platforms, but right now I'm the writer, so you can call me Trevor. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, a lot of other places. In the description of the YouTube video, you can find that information. I'm just going to move a window here so that I can see everything that's going on. So yeah, this is the show where this was an idea I got from another writer. I wish I could remember his name, but I can't. I was at a symposium at Gen Con a couple years back, and this writer talked about how he had gotten pretty good feedback and interaction by doing a show, a podcast basically, or a video show on YouTube about writing and editing while he was writing his own book. So I thought it'd be fun. I thought it'd be interesting to do. Maybe you guys would not hate my voice too much, and you could listen to me talk for a couple hours, reading to you my book as I work on editing it. It's possible that I'll have to self-publish, so I had to come to grips with that, and that means I'll have to go through another round of editing all on my own because I'm not going to pay somebody else to edit my book. That's not a good idea. So. I thought I'd try this and see how it goes. And we're actually in chapter 32. This is our sixth, I believe this is our sixth episode of the show. We're roughly, what are we, halfway through? Let me click here because the page count's weird. We're a little over halfway through the book. Actually a good bit over halfway through the book. And just so you have a quick background, I'm not going to break it down too much more because I've done this several times, but this is a political dystopian thriller. There are political themes. I tried very hard to catch both ends of the bizarre progressive spectrum, both conservative and liberal progressives. I tried to give you a world based on the most extreme views that I've seen actual people say. So some of the themes, some of the things that happen in this book, and some of the ways this world is set in this not too distant future are based on ideas that real people have. I took those ideas and said, what would a world look like if those people actually had enough power to make the changes they wanted to make? For example, the FBI recorded a Weather Underground meeting back in the 70s where a man suggested that the only way we would change the world or change the United States is if we killed a quarter of the population and put a half of the population into re-education camps. So some of these ideas are not too outlandish. Well, they are outlandish, but they're not based in fantasy. They are based in real ideas that people had. So I put them in the book, created a world, and said, what would it look like and how would people behave in that world? So that's what the book's sort of about. John and his family and his friends have left. America is split. They have left a very strict fascist sort of America, going for the free America that people used to know. They're on foot, traveling, they're being chased. Of course, the government doesn't want it to get out that 56 people left, have fled the country. It looks bad, so on and so forth. So that's where it's going. Before I started, I wanted to share some tips because I get asked this sometimes, and I thought this show would be a good place to also help tips for writers. Now, I have a couple of shorts published. I write a lot of articles on journalistic stuff. I don't have a novel published yet. This is my first novel that I'm hoping to get published. But so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Obviously, nobody writes the same. This is the best advice I heard from Maxwell Drake. You cannot teach another person how to write like you do. You can tell a person how you write, and you can give a person sort of the basics and the ideas and structure of writing and how best to put their thoughts together and all of that, but you cannot teach another person how to get published. So all of my ideas may or may not work for me. They may or may not work for you. It's your job to adapt those ideas to what works for you and do your best to take those ideas and form them into your own process. But one of the things that I think every writer should do and should have, if you're just starting out and you're not sure, what do I need to do? What are the kinds of things that would help me be a good writer? I found when I first started, when I really got heavy into ideas, writing, poetry, short stories, and I was constantly having ideas, and I was picking up any scratch piece of paper, piece of car. I actually worked at a retail store, and I would tear off tops of cardboard boxes while I was working stock because, I had a great idea, and I would jot it down on this piece of cardboard. Or a store ad, I would write it in the margin of a store ad, and I would shove it in my pocket, and I would get home, and I would put that piece of paper on my desk, and before long I had these just stacks of scrap paper and cardboard all over the place. And so eventually I was like, I need to break down and get notebooks, and I finally did. And I think the thing that every writer should have, and you can find these anywhere. You can actually order them online. You see this says Field Notes. Now, I don't specifically say this brand because I also have this generic one that's not Field Notes, and this is not a Moleskine either. I'll say right now I don't buy Moleskine. I think they're overpriced. They're not made from, or at least they weren't a few years back, weren't made from recycled materials, and they're not made in the U.S., so I do not buy Moleskine. There are several great U.S.-based companies. If you're in the U.S., if you're in the U.K., or if you're watching from Europe, or you're watching from whatever other country you're in, if you have a local or a regional manufacturer of notebooks like this, buy from them. Buy local. Support your local economy. I live in the States, so I buy U.S. So whether it be one of these Field Notes books, or whether it be a generic book, or even if you want to buy a Moleskine because you think they're cool because what Hemingway used them or whatever, as long as you have one of these in your pocket. The great thing about these is they fit in your pocket, they fit in a purse, they fit in a fanny pack, they fit wherever you could. Actually, they are smaller than a cell phone. Wherever you could put a cell phone, you could put one of these. Anytime you have an idea, you have notes, you have sketching down article ideas or short story ideas or poetry ideas or anything that comes to mind, write it in this book. Always have a pen. This is the other thing you need to always have. A lot of times you'll find guys hardly ever carry pens. Girls almost always have pens. They have a pen in their purse. So this isn't too surprising for a lot of the female authors out there. Because you almost always have a pen, but a lot of guys don't have a pen. I always have a pen tucked in the collar of every shirt everywhere I go. If I leave the house, I have a pen right here, everywhere. My wife doesn't carry a pen because I always have a pen. Even if you don't have your notebook, if you have a pen, you can tear off a piece of paper, a piece of ad, a piece of newspaper, a napkin, something, and write down an idea. Don't leave home without a pen. And I know you can take notes on your cell phone and you can text your things on your cell phone, and I've done that before, but have you ever tried to type out a long thought on your if you're not 16 years old like those kids? I don't know how they do it. I can't type like that on my cell phone, so I hate taking notes on my cell phone. It takes too long. I can write faster with a pen. So you always have this. Now, I also always have in my backpack, which goes with me most places I'm going to be. For when I go to work, my pack goes with me. When I go on trips, my pack goes with me. When when I'm away from the house for more than a few hours, my pack goes with me. In my pack is a larger notebook. This is a company that went out of business, so it doesn't even matter to tell you what brand it was. But it was another local U.S.-based company. They used recycled materials. They were priced about the same as Moleskine. The quality of the paper is just as good. I liked the fact that they were American made, supporting American jobs. But when this gets full, it goes in here, and then I put everything, I start a new one. This is all my ideas, my notes, my outlines for stories, for future stories. There are probably 24 pages of notes in here for the story we're about to go through. You need one of these, whether it be this or a composition book or a notebook or something. I know a lot of people put notes on their computer. That's great and all, but what happens when your power's out? What happens when your computer crashes? What happens when you're on a trip and your laptop won't boot up? You can't get to those ideas that you need because you can't access whatever device you put on. I know it seems old school to write on paper, and I'm a huge advocate of handwriting on paper. I write faster that way. I get my ideas down faster that way than I do when I'm typing. Some of these short, like this book that we're about to go through, all 85,000 words of it, I hand wrote most of it before I put it in the computer. So always have one of these. So that's my tip for the day. Carry notebooks. Carry little pocket notebooks so that you can carry them anywhere. Always have a pen, whether it's tucked in your shirt or in your... I used to tuck it in my pocket, but then different styles of jeans that don't work so well that way. So I tuck it in my shirt. Always have a pen. And then have a larger notebook that you carry most places where you can transfer those ideas to or write in longer form in those notebooks. These things are invaluable and they will come in handy later down the road. Do it. So that's my tips for today. Now we're going to jump into the story. We're on chapter 32. Every chapter begins with an excerpt from John Everman's journal. John is our protagonist. He's our main character. He's the guy that got a bunch of people together that decided that they were going to head out on a journey to find something better. So I use John Everman's journal excerpts to sort of give you a little insight into how the world became the way it was and John's view of that world. Rather than building this huge prologue that a lot of people like to do, like an entire chapter about, well, this happened then and then this and this led to that and this is why the world is the way it is. I use these little bitty excerpts, paragraphs, sometimes 2 or 3 paragraphs, to sort of give you that backstory as we go. I found it a little more interesting than reading this long, boring historical prologue. And yes, I'm enjoying a beer. Drink responsibly. Don't drink unless you're over 21. I had to fast for blood work today, and I haven't had beer in 48 hours. And if you know me, and you know my site's called Frags and Beer, 48 hours is a long time for me to go without one beer, much less, none. So, yeah. All right, chapter 32. I always wondered when we went from a people that held out our hands to help each other to holding out our hands expecting help from the government. America was a proud nation built on the idea that we could do for ourselves and our neighbors what no one else could. We shrugged off the rule of a tyrant and built a society that other countries used as a model for their own. Other countries. We made mistakes, some of them terrible. But in the end, we built a country that other people wanted to be part of. Somewhere there was a turning point, a point when we stopped standing above our government and looking within and around us when we needed something and started looking up, hoping government would do it for us. I don't like that sentence. Hold on. Somewhere there was a turning point. Point when we... I think I can take this out. Somewhere there's a turning point when we stopped standing above our government and looking within when we needed something and started looking up, hoping the government would do it for us. This is a key point, not only in his belief, but in my belief, and this is also where some of my political stuff came out, but not a ton of it, because John isn't exactly like, he's got some of my ideas, but he's got other ideas from people that he's sort of an amalgam of several different people's views and opinions. But this is a big one for me, because there was a time where if you needed something, you did it yourself, or your neighbor helped you, or you helped your neighbor. And now when people need something, they're like, well, how can I get funding for it? How can I get a grant for this? How can I get tax credits for this? How can I get assistance with this? And those things are all fine and good for the people that really truly need it. Like, those things were designed for people who literally were at the end of their rope and they needed a boost. They needed a little help. But the idea that should be like a last resort. And part of this idea, actually, and I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to throw them under the bus, but for example, I have been on government assistance before, and it was one of the worst things that I feel like I've ever done. I hated every minute of being on unemployment, and it wasn't my fault that I lost my job, that I got laid off. I had to go on unemployment to help pay the bills. It was no fault of anybody's, really, but I hated every moment of it. I did not like it at all, because I don't like the idea of relying on somebody else for my needs. And at a similar time, I knew somebody who was on unemployment, and they intentionally uh, asked for too much money every job they applied to, knowing that it would keep them from getting a job, allowing them to stay on unemployment for the full extent of that term. And now, granted, I know we pay the taxes, unemployment's coming out of that. It's not really technically government assistance, but still the idea that I should be getting money from somebody else for something that I'm not doing, like I'm not doing anything for that money, bugged the crap out of me, but it didn't bug them. And I can't grasp that concept. And when did we go from a country that built things with our own two hands, that helped our neighbors, that picked ourselves up from the dirt, that scrabbled and scraped and built one of the most advanced societies in the quickest time? I mean, North America went from the Stone Age to the Industrial Age in a heartbeat compared to the rest of the world. And now it's like we can't even get out of bed half the time without help from somebody outside our own family. And I don't get it. I've never understood that concept, and John doesn't understand it either. Doesn't understand where, but there was a change. There was a change when we went from one way of thinking to the other, and I think that has led to some of the problems that we have and some of the problems that John faces in his world. All right, so while Lieutenant Casey was laying a trap for the refugees, a group of parents were having a subdued celebration after receiving news of their children's safety. Now, if you missed last week, John's group met a smaller group of young people and children on their way through Missouri, and these kids helped them in way, they gave them some food, they gave them some shelter for the night. They also had a radio built to pick up transmissions from the Republic of Texas, and these parents got news that their children reached the border safely. Their children were in a stolen van being driven by a couple of other adults in the group, and they made it to the border and across safely. So the parents received that news last night, and that's what they're celebrating for. The kids from Madison shared in their joy with the knowledge that others near their own age and younger had made it to freedom. John, Amanda, Todd, and Jennifer were still near the now silent radio. "What happened to the signal?" John asked. "When the feds find it, they block it. Sometimes we get more time, but usually they find it in a couple of minutes. The frequency and time are always random, and sometimes we don't even find it before the feds do," Jennifer explained. John was frustrated that they wouldn't hear more. He sighed, and his body sagged a little with how useless he felt, but also relief at the news they had received. It was one large weight off his shoulders. "They're safe, John." Amanda put her hand on his shoulder. "At least we know that much." John nodded and pulled her into an embrace. Todd gave him a smile and gestured for Jennifer to follow him to his friends, so his friends could have some privacy. The two held each other tightly for some time before John kissed the top of her head and leaned back to look down at her. "More than half our task is done," John said. "We can't let our guard down yet, though. It's going to get more dangerous the closer we get to the border." I can actually make that 2 sentences. I have a habit of making my sentences really long, I've been told, so it's going to get more dangerous the closer we get to the border. We have to get the rest of them across. Now these children as well, Amanda agreed. "Sarah said they have Benny. It won't take long for that agent to find out what happened. They'll try harder to stop us," John said. "Still, a long way to go and a long, hard road." So I think we know Amanda and John are talking, so I don't really need Amanda said there. I'm going to shorten that up a little bit. "We'll walk it together to the end." John hugged her again. By the time they joined the rest, the revelry had calmed considerably. It was apparent to John that everyone was exhausted. They had all eaten, and the excitement of the previous night, combined with the evening's excitement, was taking its toll. We're going to change that up. I don't like that sentence. They had all eaten. And the excitement of the last 2 nights was taking its toll. Are you sure no one will come looking for you out here? John asked Jennifer. No, we never broadcast, so there's no signal to trace. And we never come straight here to ensure we aren't... And we never come straight here to ensure we aren't followed. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Jennifer replied. He asked her a question. She replied. What about your parents? Amanda asked. Most people in this town support the government. A couple of us don't live with our parents anymore. I was reassigned here when I turned 18, but when the mill closed, my paperwork must have been lost and I fell through the cracks. A couple of others go to work often enough that they aren't missed, Jennifer explained. The younger ones tell their parents they're going to play with friends, and no one questions it. We won't be able to tell them where we're going. We won't be able to tell them where we've gone, the young woman continued. Maybe they could be convinced this is the right thing, Todd said. We tried that once. Thankfully, we didn't bring Cindy's dad here, but he won't let her out of the house now. We just don't know who we can trust, so when we get to Texas, we'll send letters back, and if our families want to join us, it'll be their choice. Yeah, I'm going to refix all that, too. We just don't know who we can trust. When we get to Texas, we'll send letters back, and if our families want to join us, it'll be their choice. And we won't have to risk being caught. John looked around at the kids again, realizing that they grew up beyond their years. Because of the way things were for them. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to want something so much to cause a child to rush out into the world and leave everything they knew behind. He realized as he looked around that the youngest of them must be 14 or 15, an age that was considered an adult only a handful of generations ago. Perhaps it wasn't so unusual that these young people were deciding to take their lives into their own hands and fight for their future, even if it meant leaving their families behind. They're so young, Amanda said, as if thinking along the same lines John had. We don't need that. We just expressed John's thoughts. There are younger siblings that we have to leave behind. As much as I want to take everyone, I had to draw the line somewhere, and 14 seemed the most reasonable age, Jennifer said. 14 is still young, Amanda said. We're going to change this one. Explained. It wasn't so long ago that it was old enough to fight a war or get married, Jennifer said firmly. True enough, John noted. If these young people wish to find freedom, who are we to stop them? We should get back before it gets too late. Some of the others will be coming in later tonight. They shouldn't bother you, Jennifer explained. Aren't you all past curfew anyway? You might get caught if you try to go home now, John said. The police here don't pay all that much attention. The night officer is probably snoring with his feet on his desk right now, Jennifer said. She explained like 3 times. We don't need that many times. John nodded, and the kids started to leave in pairs at different intervals. They didn't expect any trouble, but they weren't taking any chances. John approved of the wisdom. As a matter of fact, John was impressed all around. This group of mostly children was showing great discipline and forethought. They would do well in their new home when they all reached Texas. Within an hour, all the children had left and the refugees settled down to sleep. The hay scattered around the barn made for comfortable and warm bedding. With the nights getting colder, they were thankful for the added insulation. John noticed that, though the hay bales could have been used to create private areas, everyone lay down within reach of each other. The ordeal they were going through together had brought all of the... Yeah, we don't need that in there. The ordeal they were going through had brought all of these people closer, as if they were one family. They had all struggled, cried, laughed, and grieved together. They each became important to the others over the few days on the run. John smiled as Amanda and he lay down, and he pulled her close. He pulled her close. He wrapped his arms around her protectively. Todd was within reach, and he could feel the presence of someone else behind him, close enough to reach out and wake him in case there was need. He finally relaxed and let his mind drift off to much-needed sleep. His final thought before losing himself to the whim of his subconscious was of his children. They had made it. From now on, in those moments of self-doubt, when he wondered if this had all been worth it, he could be sure that it was. All right. So chapter 33. Oh, that's why I put... You're going to see some Steam notifications. Sorry about that. Friends of mine jumping on and off of various games. Alrighty. Everyone remembers where they were on September 11th. That's what they say, right? I'm sure it's mostly true. At least that people remember what they were doing when they heard what happened. I don't, probably because I was too young. I think that's a blessing, that children don't remember tragedy like that. Sure, they know something is wrong at the time. Our parents' look of horror while they watch the events on television is something a child wouldn't miss. They would have seen the images and known that people were getting hurt, but children quickly forget. Later, before everything changed and our study of history became regulated, I read about the events of that day and the days that followed. There are a few moments in our history, always tragic incidents, where things change. It's always fleeting, but for those few days after the towers fell, people were different. We grieved together, cried and worked together despite all the differences. For those few days, no one cared about religion or politics, race or gender. We were all Americans, and that was all that mattered. We had been hurt, and we worked together to help each other. Sadly, that moment didn't last. It wasn't long before fingers were pointed, decisions questioned, and blame laid. So the same old arguments came back, fights over nothing, debates over nothing. They always say, cherish the moments because they're gone before you know it. I just wish some moments could last. Casey's frustration mounted as he made the drive south to the border post. He hoped that he would get some useful information out of the prisoner, but he couldn't help but worry because he was driving further away from where he believed the fugitives were. He was certain Benny was a distraction, but having lost the other's trail, he had no other choice but to find out for sure. I think it should be plural possessive, right? Other's trail? Yeah. To add to his stress, the closer he got to the border... it doesn't like that comma. The closer he got to the border, the worse the roads became. Most of the roads out this far were only used by the military, and the government didn't see the need to repair roads that military vehicles would just tear up again. That was the official reason, but Casey imagined it had a lot more to do with this part of the country simply being out of sight and mind. With the contraction of the populace away from the borders, it meant less time and resources had to be spent on upkeep in remote areas. After all, citizens could not get upset about a problem if they didn't see it. And a lot of people were happy to remain blissfully ignorant. Isn't that always the way? Nope, did that wrong. There we go. When Casey reached the border post, he was waved through the gate by a bored-looking soldier. The post itself was a collection of barracks and administration buildings inside a tall chain-link fence topped with razor-sharp concertina wire. The western fence line of the compound was part of the DMZ fence, with a path between it and another fence wide enough for a truck to drive through, and connected to the patrol road that ran the length of the border fence. The security of the complex was completed by a guard tower on each corner of the fence line. Casey drove... I don't think we need fence line there. Guard tower on each corner. Casey drove through the sliding gate that was opened for him by another guard. A third soldier approached the SUV on the driver's side. Casey stopped and rolled down the window. "You've come about the prisoner?" the soldier asked. Casey nodded. "Captain Green called me yesterday." "Pull through to Building 3. Office is straight down the hall from the main entrance," the soldier said, pointing to one of the large administration buildings. Casey parked in front of the building between two olive green trucks marked with Army insignia and entered the main doors of the single-story building. It was a familiar place, just like all other government buildings. Casey looked at the same grayish-green paint, the same white floor tile, and the same white drop ceiling that was used to construct every federal building in the country. What it lacked in imagination, he always thought, it made up for in putting a person at ease in a new place. It was familiar, like home, and anywhere he went in America he knew he'd find more just like it. He walked to the end of the hall and knocked on the metal door that was identical to the one leading to his own office. I put this in there intentionally, and this is an important thing in Casey's perspective of the world. I wanted to use Casey as sort of a counterpoint to John, in that John is leaving this part of America because he believes there's something wrong with it. He believes in individuality. He believes in making his own decisions. He believes in the community, but in the community based on a group of individuals, not as a collective commune. And Casey, on the other hand, believes in things being the same and the things being familiar and everything being regimented and in order, and he doesn't believe that individual choice should overrule the collective community. And he likes that order and sameness. He likes everything to be exactly as he would expect it to be. Whereas John wants things to be good for everybody without restricting anybody's individual interests or ideas. And so that scene right there, that comfort that Casey feels when he enters a building that's just like the one he works in back in Peoria, sort of shows how he feels about his world. He doesn't like anything changing. He doesn't like anything being different. He expects to get up every day and do the same thing. He expects to eat the same thing, and he wants his world to be all the same. And John is actually throwing his world off. John is throwing Casey's world off. And Casey has already started to express his frustration with it. He's started to develop strange habits and fixations, like he picked up a toy car that he remembers from his childhood from an old rundown antique mall that he was hiding in. You know, like these events are screwing up Casey's regimented world, and he's finally found a place where he can breathe again because it's the same. The sameness has made him comfortable. And that's why I put that scene in there the way I did, because I wanted you to see how Casey's dealing with this and how he likes his world to be versus how John sees things. So he knocked on the door that's just like the one at his office. "Come in," said a muffled voice Casey recognized from the previous night. Casey opened the door. Behind the functional metal desk sat a large black man in a camouflage military uniform. The officer's dress and manner was as meticulous and disciplined as his office. There wasn't a single piece of decoration in the room, and the items that were present were arranged precisely on the desk or shelves. Everything in the room had a purpose, right down to paper clips and a small cup within easy reach of the large officer. Casey had never seen another government employee take his job as seriously as Captain Green obviously did. "Lieutenant Casey, sit down, please," Green said in his rumbling voice. "I'd like to question the prisoner right away," Casey said. He did not move toward the indicated chair. I think we're going to take that out because we know who's talking. Economy of words. It's an important... I know we strive as writers. Here's another little tip that I've gotten by having my work looked at by other writers. We strive as writers to push out, like, we want to get our story out to a certain word count, and that often drives us to fill in a lot of fluff. And sometimes you got to cut back. You got to cut the fat. You got to get that economy of words out, because it'll get to the point where you'll be repetitive. You'll be repeating yourself. You'll be saying things you don't need to say. There's two people in this room. Captain Green is the first one to talk. The second person to respond is going to be Casey. We don't have to say Casey said. But you don't want to go so far as to, like, I don't know if you've ever read The Road or anything else by Cormac McCarthy. In The Road, anyway, I don't know about his other books, but in The Road, he doesn't use conversation identifiers except for the very first sentence. So it'll be, you know, let's do this today, said the dad, because the book, nobody has names in the book. And then the next line will be a response to that by the son, and no other conversation, no other text, or not text, but no other phrase said by another character in that entire conversation is going to tell you who said it. You just have to follow along. And if you lose your place, you forget who's talking, you have to go back to the top and start again. And that's frustrating. Don't do that. But if you don't need to say who said something, don't. You don't need to identify every piece of conversation with who said it when it's implied. So that's one way to get your economy of words, to cut back a little bit of the fat, is you don't always have to say who said something. Read it. You probably don't even notice it. When you read your favorite book, watch it next time. Watch how the conversation is done. The author's not always going to tell you who's talking, but you know, you instinctively know who's saying what if you're following the conversation. So that's just a little tip, cutting back the fat, and why I do that sometimes there, because I have a bad habit of, I put a lot of fat in the first couple of drafts of my books. We all do it. So that's what I'm trying to do here. All right, so you're earlier than I expected, Lieutenant. I have to finish this report. Green looked up at Casey. The captain was obviously used to having his orders followed without question. Casey could respect that. He was on Captain Green's turf, and he would have to play by Green's rules. He took a seat, sitting stiffly, and watched the officer as he went back to making notes on the report in front of him. Relax, Lieutenant. The prisoner is eating breakfast anyway, Green said without looking up. Casey sat back and resigned himself to waiting until the captain was done with his work. He looked around the office, noting that nothing was out of place or without purpose. It was clear this officer was more... We already said that, though. So I think we're going to take... We're going to take this out. It was clear this officer... He looked around the office. It was clear this officer... Looked around the room. It sounds weird when we put those two words together. It was clear this officer was more than devoted to his job. This was his life. The lieutenant was used to federal officers and soldiers that did only what was required of them. Punch in, punch out, and then avoid any extra work. The lieutenant was used to federal officers and soldiers that did only what was required of them. Punch in, punch out, and avoid any extra work. The military was different in that they could not go home at the end of the day, but to expect one of them to do more than was their contract was like asking for a miracle. Casey imagined Green didn't even have a copy of his contract on hand to show anyone that thought to violate it. Green put a final mark on the last page of his report, put the pages back in order, and arranged it neatly in a plain brown folder before standing up. He should be done eating by now, and I have time to take you around, Green said, walking toward the door. Casey stood up to follow. Outside his office, the captain dropped the folder in a metal bin attached to the wall outside his door. It would be someone else's job to come by and collect the paperwork and drop it off where it needed to be. Green obviously trusted his staff enough to do the jobs that needed to be done. Casey would have delivered the paperwork himself just to make sure it got there. Green led the way down a side hallway away from the main doors. Have you had any trouble on the border recently, other than the prisoner you have? Casey asked. Nothing to speak of. We see a few patrols on the other side of the DMZ from time to time, but it's been quiet for a long time here, Green said. No one trying to cross from this side? Casey asked. Not since the war. The prisoner is our first. The captain stopped in front of a locked door and pulled out a set of keys. The first in my area, anyway. If it's happening elsewhere, no one is talking about it. The door opened in a short hall lined on both sides by cells. The door opened into a short hall lined on both sides by cells. The cells were nothing more than cages of chain link with a pair of cots in each. The only occupant of the cell block sat on a cot in the first cell on the right. Bernard Saunders. Casey wasted no time getting down to business when he saw the prisoner. Everyone just calls me Benny. There was no malice or anger in the response. You left Illinois with John Everman and his group of fugitives? Casey asked. Never heard of him, Benny said without taking his eyes off the bunk across from him. Casey just nodded. He hadn't expected the man to just start talking anyway. We know you disappeared from Stewart about the same time the others did. The van you were found with was the same one stolen from federal agents who were transporting John and others back to Peoria. Casey started to lay out the facts to show Benny how futile it was to deny his involvement. He was interrupted by Benny's low chuckle. Something about that funny to you? Yeah, your agents lost their van to a group of citizens that were locked up in the back. If what you say is true anyway. Benny looked at Casey now, and the lieutenant was faced with the fact that the man was resigned to whatever happened to him. Benny was relaxed, confident, and the laugh was genuine, not nervous. Besides, who's to say I didn't steal it from them, or find it on the road somewhere? Why are you down here, Benny? Did John send you as a distraction? Casey didn't expect an answer, but he hoped for some reaction that might confirm his suspicions. Road trip, Benny said. Road trip? Casey repeated. Sure, you know, drive around the country, take in the sights. Maybe bore my relatives back home with hundreds of slides of gray, prison-like government buildings and the like, Benny said with a smile. Listen, Benny, Casey wanted to regain control of the conversation. I can offer you a lighter sentence and your choice of relocation if you cooperate with me. I might even be able to commute your time at re-education if I can put on my report that you had a change of heart and helped me. This did get a reaction, but not the one Casey expected. In a flash, the large bearded man was on his feet, inches from the chain link that separated the two men. Casey had already been close to the cage, and the size of him, the speed of his movement, made the lieutenant step back. That's your problem, you and your kind, Benny began. His voice was low, and Casey could see he was clenching his jaw tight enough to make the tendons in his neck stand out. He continued, You honestly believe that everyone is just looking out for themselves. You think we would rather have you feds take care of us. Casey could sense that if the cage weren't there, Benny's clenched fist would be reaching for his throat right then. Some of us believe in taking care of each other by making sure we can all take care of ourselves. This is your last chance, Benny. Help me and I can help you, Casey said. But he knew it was pointless. He had lost control of the situation by backing down, and it was clear that Benny wasn't going to betray his friends. Let's fix that there. That's where you're wrong, Lieutenant. Benny backed up and sat on the cot again. I've done what I was meant to do, and there's nothing you can do to me now that will change that. That'll change that. Betty doesn't talk that properly. That'll change that. Only God can help me now, and one way or another I'll be free someday. The big man sat back against the cage next to the cot and closed his eyes. Whether he wanted it or not, Casey knew the interview was over. He wasn't foolish enough to think he could get anything useful out of the prisoner. He turned and walked back to the cell block door where Green was waiting in the hall. Did you find what you were looking for? Green asked as he locked the door again. No, but maybe the van he was in will tell me something. It's in the motor pool. This way. Green led him down the hall toward the main doors. Casey was quiet as they walked across the compound to the large buildings that housed the installation's vehicles. This group of people he had come to think of as fugitives surprised him at every turn. He was used to people who wanted nothing more than an easy life and to be left alone. John's people, however, were intentionally making their lives harder. And for what? A life in a country where everyone had to fend for themselves? Everyone knew what it was like in Texas, or at least what the government said it was like. Casey believed it, though. It was like America used to be, people working for money, trying to earn enough to feed their families and pay the bills. You had to search for a job and hope you were good at it so you kept it. He wondered if having that choice was really worth all the effort. He snatched his hand out of his pocket when he realized he'd been rubbing the little toy car with his thumb. Too many of these questions had been filling his mind since starting this case, and he didn't like it at all. We locked the van in here so it wouldn't be disturbed, Green said, pulling out his keys again to unlock the small garage. "Thank you, Captain," Casey said when the door was opened. He stepped through and looked for the light switch. The one next to the door brought the lights overhead to flickering life. The van was parked in the middle of the garage with the doors closed and no sign anyone had been inside or searched it. He walked around the back of the black vehicle looking for anything that might be readily apparent from the outside. "No one has touched it except the driver. It's been locked up since we brought it here," Green said from the doorway. The captain was leaning against the inside wall, seeming content to wait for Casey to finish his search. He felt like he was being silently criticized by the officer, and it made him uncomfortable, like an itch between the shoulder blades. Well, an itch between my shoulder blades that he couldn't quite reach. This entire ordeal was an embarrassment to the federal police, especially Casey's division. "Are you going to hover over me the whole time?" Casey asked, unable to keep the annoyance out of his voice. "Your van, my facility," Green said, as if that were explanation enough. "Don't worry, I won't hover. I'll stay right over here." Casey cursed under his breath and opened the driver door, trying not to think about his chaperone. There were no readily apparent clues in the front of the van, and after searching under the seats and in the storage compartments, Casey pushed the door closed in frustration. He wouldn't accept that Benny had been alone, simply driving around in a stolen van. He moved to the back doors and pulled them open. At first glance, the back of the van was empty as well. Casey climbed in, his frustration mounting, and worked his way toward the cage that separated the back from the front seats. The floor was clear of any trash or debris. Even the step next to the side doors, used to make entry from the side easier, was devoid of anything that might help. He worked his way back, checking storage compartments along the side. He found what he expected to find: tools, a flashlight, road flares, and jumper cables. He was about to give up hope when he reached the last storage container in the back. He looked in to find the glassy eyes of a toy bear staring back at him. The lieutenant was initially struck by how abandoned and sad the toy looked. He knew it was crazy to think like that, but he did all the same. It was clearly a family heirloom, kept hidden during the collection of unnecessary property years ago. It was a much better quality than the toys given to children by the government. Too good to be lying forgotten in a greasy bin in the back of a van. Casey knew right away, without really understanding why, that this bear had been loved, and whoever had forgotten it must be missing it terribly. Casey pulled the bear out of the bin and closed the back doors of the van. He stepped around it and headed for the garage door. "I'll call Peoria and have the van picked up. Thank you for your help, Captain," Casey said when he reached the door. After a stiff nod, he stepped out of the door and started for his SUV. Stepped out of the garage. And started for his SUV. "What, did you find anything?" Green asked. He couldn't have missed the bear in Casey's hand. He was fishing for information. Casey stopped and turned, holding out the toy. "Everything, Captain," Casey said. He started to turn back to his SUV again. "What about the prisoner?" Green asked. Casey stopped again. "Let him go." "Lieutenant?" Green sounded like he had just been told to learn to fly. "He's done what he came here to do. He'll be no good in re-education. I've seen his type before. He'd just be another prisoner costing the state money for the rest of his life," Casey said by way of explanation. Casey turned back to his car. He didn't turn back to his vehicle. It's not a car. Vehicle with a V for Victor, or for vehicle. He didn't stop this time, and Green didn't question him further. Climbed into the SUV and set the bear in the passenger seat, looking at it again like it held all the answers. As far as Casey was concerned, it answered more questions without speaking than Benny ever would. This was what the man had been doing. He wasn't a distraction to pull Casey off the others. The big man had a bigger mission. He'd gotten the kids out. This would make Casey's job harder and more dangerous. If the fugitives knew that Benny had succeeded, they wouldn't have anything left to lose. He just had to hope they didn't. He just hoped they didn't find out before he found them. Oh, if I could spell. Hoped they didn't find out before he found them. Alright, so there's that chapter. What time we got? 4:45. Alright, chapter 34, and another excerpt from John Everman. So let me know, too, just taking a little break here, let me know what you think about the show, about the story. If you do see anything unusual or strange, drop it in the comments if you're watching the recording. If you are watching the show right now, definitely let me know. Hold on, text from my wife. I'm going to answer her real quick. So 1 second. Same old boring. Alright. So let me know what you think. Let's see if we got any posts here that I want to answer real quick. We got some tweets from the Twitters. I'm going to check this real quick. And then we'll move on. We just got some people sharing some stuffs. Thank you so much, Gwen. Lots of people. I got a little gnat flying around in here. I'm going to close the door real quick. My son just jumped in the shower. So give me a second here. Unfortunately, this house is a smaller house, so the bathroom's right next to my office, which is really nice when I need to use the restroom when I'm gaming, but it means the sound it cuts through. Okay. So we're all good there, we're all good here. All right, chapter 34. We've all heard that freedom isn't easy or free, but how many of us have really sat down and thought about what that means? When people aren't free, they will fight. They'll fight and die to get it. Oh, yeah, I remember this excerpt. I really like this one. When people aren't free, they'll fight and die to get it. Slaves and subjects shed blood to break their bonds. Throughout history, no civilization became free without great suffering, nor did they keep it without effort. How can we expect to just sit back and hold on to something that is so difficult to get? You don't let someone else do the work. You hold on to it with everything you have. When you put the responsibility for your freedom in the hands of someone else, you may think you're free, but it's the worst sort of slavery there is. This, I think, is super important, not only for Casey's mindset, but also for a lot of people out there, whether you're, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. We didn't get here without a lot of effort. And if you expect somebody else to keep you safe and free and protect your rights and do all those things for you, you are a slave to that person, whether you like it or not. If you give all of the power to keep you free to the government, you're a slave to the government. If you give it to a corporation, you're a slave to the corporation, or whatever it is. You have to be active and responsible for your own safety and freedom and rights. You have to speak out in defense of your own rights. Otherwise, you're just letting somebody else do the work for you, and if they stop doing the work, or if they decide to change how they do it, you're under their control, and you're a slave. So that's sort of what that means, is don't give up your responsibility to take care of yourself to somebody else. That puts you, that makes you, their subject, and that's not a way to live. It's not what we fought to get here for. All right. In the barn north of Madison, the last person on watch started to wake people an hour before dawn. The sky outside was just starting to lighten in expectation of the rising sun. Rations were quickly handed out and consumed, and bags were being packed when Amanda found John outside. He was standing alone in the semi-darkness, looking south and west toward Texas. "I love this time of day," John said when she stepped close. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. She's already close. Put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned. Taking a deep breath of the chilly air, he closed his eyes and listened as the world started to slowly wake up around them. It had been a long while since John was able to simply enjoy such a morning. "I know, John, you always have." She fell silent and enjoyed the moment with him. For just a few minutes they could feel real peace before they had to get back to reality. The air was starting to fill with the sounds of birds getting ready for the day, and the colors of the world were changing with the light so gradually one could easily miss it. To John there were few colors more beautiful than the green of grass and leaves, or the grayish blue sky before the sun is actually above the horizon. This would have been the time coffee would be brewing in the house, and John would be doing the things he enjoyed doing in the peace before the day actually seemed to start. He was determined to enjoy those things again in a home of his family's choosing. That is what it would be when they reached Texas, their home. I actually wrote that scene after I used to work for a soda company distributing soda to stores, and I was in the back of a large department store waiting for the truck to show up. And it was real early because I did this job super early, so it was just before dawn, just before the sun came up, and I was just standing there out behind this store. And behind this store, I live in a small town in the middle of Illinois, and so this store is on the edge of town, and behind it was nothing but fields and trees, and for as far as you could see, there was nothing back there but just farm fields. And that's what it was like. I was just standing there listening to that, and I love that myself. I love getting up. I work early. I do everything early. Even on the weekends, I'm usually up early, and I love being outside right before the sun comes up. It's probably the best time of day to me, and that's why I wrote this. Actually, after standing out there, I went right away and I wrote this scene because I loved it. I just love that time of day. So, people are slower to get up today. Amanda finally broke the silence, though she kept her voice low. My arm is itching. They're exhausted. We'll be making less time, though I expect we're only 7 or 8 days away if we aren't delayed too much. John said. "We'll get there, John," Amanda said with confidence. "I think we can take out," John said there. "We know it's just the two of them. Again, we don't need to say who's talking if we know, because there's only 2 of them." "We'll get there, John," Amanda said with confidence. "I just don't want to lose anyone else on the way," he said. "John, you can't take this all on yourself." She knew he would, despite her words. "You've got Steve's family across. I'm sure he's grateful for that." John knew she was right, but he would never shake the feeling that he was partially responsible for Steve's death. He was determined that he would do whatever it would take to make sure Steve's family wanted for nothing. "Here they come," Amanda said quietly. John followed Amanda's gaze and saw the kids from Madison coming toward the barn in small groups. Some of the kids that had come in overnight and stayed in the barn were coming out to greet their friends. It made him long for the voices of his own children as he listened to these young people laugh and catch up. "We're ready when you are," Jennifer said, coming to stand in front of John and Amanda. "Give us old folks a couple minutes. We're almost ready," John smiled. Jennifer chuckled and nodded, going to talk to her friends while they waited. Both Amanda and John saw Todd come out of the barn and walk over to join Jennifer. He was one of the youngest of the refugees from Illinois and the only single member of their group. He'd been a friend of John's since starting at the factory and eventually started attending their meetings. Their secret. We haven't talked about the meetings since the first couple chapters. When he got close, Jennifer looked at him and returned the smile that was already on his face. Amanda squeezed John's hand and pulled him inside to finish getting ready. "It's nice to see young love start to blossom in the midst of all this," Amanda said. "Couldn't agree more," John replied. We're going to say that. John replied. Sounds better. The refugees were ready to leave in a few minutes after the arrival of their new members. Everyone was used to packing up and eating fast. They set out in their smaller groups, and the kids turned out to be fast learners as the older members explained the routine. John also found out that some of them were excellent scouts. John didn't like the idea of the young people ranging to the side or ahead. He thought it would be more dangerous, but he couldn't refuse them. He reminded himself they had joined the refugees freely and had to be allowed to make their own decisions. He also had to admit that they knew what they were doing. They were small, fast, and agile, and had spent they were small, fast, and agile, and had spent time sneaking around their town and hiding from the authorities. The refugees made good time, skirting Madison on the north and following the highway again toward Moberly. Several miles from the next town, they crossed the highway, again one group at a time, and continued on. John knew they would be turning south along a new road when they reached Moberly, and it would be easier and safer to cross the highway here than closer to the town, or taking the long way around to reach the southbound route. I think we're going to cut that out. I don't need that. Overall, the first part of the day was easy, and John noticed that the young people seemed to bring new energy to the rest. When he moved along the line, speaking to each group, he noticed smiling faces that had been exhausted the night before. They were still tired and sore, but the kids were making it easier to ignore the aches and pains. They stopped for lunch in the woods east of Moberly, getting the young people into the routine of a quick and efficient meal break. The excitement of the trip was making it difficult to get some of the younger ones to concentrate, but John knew they would catch on soon enough. He stepped toward the edge of the trees and looked toward the town that would have been where they slept the night before if they hadn't stopped in Madison. Okay, so yeah, I forgot. This is an important note. So right before we started, actually, last chapter of last episode, Casey figured they would come through Moberly, and he actually set a trap hoping to catch them. But they were delayed, the refugees were delayed in Madison by those kids they found in the barn, which caused them to spend an extra night. Spend the night in Madison that they didn't expect to spend. And so Casey missed them. Casey thought they went a different way and wound up driving south. So now they're at Moberly a day later than expected, and Casey's not here to try to catch them. So that's where we're at now. So he's looking out at the town they would have slept in the night before if they hadn't stopped in Madison. The woods were on the edge of some abandoned farmland with an old country road that split the fields and headed into town. John had noticed a large building sitting next to the road on the edge of the field. That's the building Casey set the trap in. He could see large faded white letters on the side marking the building as an antique mall. He remembered those from his childhood when his grandparents had enjoyed taking the family out on Sunday afternoons after church. They were usually large buildings built in old schools and warehouses, or sometimes barns. This one looked to have been an old barn that someone had added on to. It was large and would have made a great place for them all to sleep had they actually stopped here. "What are you looking at?" Todd asked. "Nothing, just reminiscing," John said. "Right. Well, we're ready to move," Todd said. We don't need Todd said there. We're going to take that out and put that there. "Let's go then," John said, turning back with Todd to see everyone getting into their groups. This is replied. John swept the area with his eyes and was proud to note that no evidence of their presence was left behind, as usual. Even the new additions to their group had picked up on the need to clean up after themselves. He joined Todd, Amanda, Jennifer, and 7 others in the lead group, and they started out. "Pretty smart moving in staggered groups like this," John heard Jennifer say behind him. "Yeah," Todd responded. Makes sure if one group is spotted, the others have a chance to hide or get away. They skirted Moberly and met up with Highway 63 heading south to Columbia. Their timetable was off, and John estimated they would be stopping north of the next city rather than a few miles south as he thought before. Remember, they stayed an extra time in Madison. Columbia was one of the largest cities on their route, and one he knew they would be able to avoid. There was a bridge across the Missouri west of the city, and it would add a few extra hours to their trip, but it was the only bridge for miles that wasn't right in the middle of a city. Say city like twice. Bridge across the Missouri west of the city wasn't right in the middle of a population center. The next bridge would be at Jefferson City, which crossed right into the middle of a sprawling town with few places for them to hide. The Quincy crossing had been a risk. Crossing at Jefferson City would be suicide. They would reach Columbia in the dark of night, and John felt it would be wise to push on across the bridge instead of stopping so close. I say city like 10 times in that paragraph. But it's a city. He would leave that up to the exhausted group, though. They talk about exhausted. All right, it's 5 o'clock. Oh, let me finish the chapter, and then I'll take a break. The rest of the day was quiet, uneventful. It was a welcome respite after being chased by the feds. Except for the importance of the exodus and the danger of being caught, they could almost imagine they were on a leisurely cross-country hike. They stopped in the evening to eat again, but didn't waste any time, and were back on the road soon after. We don't need stopping right there. Soon after. John noticed that the energy of the morning excitement had long worn off. Everyone was slower getting up after each break and moving more stiffly. Everyone except the kids. An hour after the dinner break, John called a halt in a wooded area near a pond. He gathered everyone around before anyone could sit down or start to relax. We're close to Columbia and it's time to make a decision. We need to go west, around the city in the dark, to reach the bridge across the river. I'd rather not take the risk of stopping so close to Columbia. Or staying near the bridge. I'd rather not take the risk of stopping so close or staying near the bridge, but it is a couple hours walk ahead of us to get across. He looked around at everyone, letting them absorb the information. This was one of those times where he couldn't make the call on his own. He needed everyone on the same page. We have 2 choices, and I'd like to hear what you all think. We can stop now and get a couple hours of rest before moving on and walk most of the day tomorrow. Or we can keep going and stop across the river and sleep the rest of the night, John explained. Looking around the group, he could tell almost everyone was weighing the decision against the pain and exhaustion in their bodies and minds. That gnat is going to drive me nuts. I don't much like the idea of trying to get back up after lying on the ground for a couple of hours. I think I'd rather keep going, Hugh, one of the older men said from the back. Others were nodding or quietly adding their assent. John could see a couple of people that looked like they would rather rest right then, but even they couldn't argue with the speaker's logic. I agree, John said. It seems like I'm more tired than sore every day. I don't want to know what it feels like to try and get up after only a couple hours of sleep. We keep moving for now? He saw nearly everyone nod at his question. He wasted no time in splitting everyone into even smaller groups and explaining the plan. They would wait 5 minutes after the group in front of them started before heading out. They would stay close to the highway until they reached the city, and then turn west and follow the edge of town. Getting close to dark, it would be easy to get lost in the fields around the town, so they had to risk staying within sight of it. He remembered from the map that the north end of town was mostly housing, so much of their walk would be through fields, parks, and backyards. If anyone was stopped, they would say their car broke down before curfew and they were on their way home. If they were captured, their sacrifice and silence would mean the rest had more of a chance to get away. They all knew the risk when they left, and they were prepared for the worst. Once they reached the west edge of town, they would turn south to meet the highway and continue on to the bridge. Once across, there was a wooded area about 200 yards south of the highway. That's where they would stop and sleep the rest of the night. Everyone would move on at dawn without exception. John's group led the way. They were down to Amanda, Todd, Jennifer, and 2 others. He didn't feel the need to look back or supervise the departure. He was confident everyone would stick to the plan, so he set his eyes forward and picked up the pace. He walked perhaps 45 minutes when John stopped and looked around. They walked for perhaps 45 minutes when John stopped and looked around. "What is it, John?" Amanda asked. "You smell that?" John asked. When Amanda shook her head, and he went on, "Smoke. I think I smell smoke." They kept walking for about 15 minutes before everyone began to smell it. After a few more minutes, they could see it as well. A couple streets in from the edge of town, a house was burning. The orange glow flared in the night sky like a miniature sunrise, and black smoke rolled through the neighborhood. John knew most cities had limited public services, especially at night, and the local police and fire departments were always understaffed. The night shift even more so. He only thought about it for a moment before he came to a decision. Guys, John indicated Todd and the other two, I need you to help me. Amanda and Jennifer, you two stay here and wait for the next group. Tell them to move fast. It will take some time for the authorities to show up, but they will, and we want everyone away from here. If the last group goes by before we come back, go with them. Amanda clearly disagreed with the plan. She knew what John intended, but she didn't argue. She also didn't intend to leave him this time, but she would deal with that when the time came. John led the others toward the house. They moved through a couple of yards and crossed the street toward the next. The glow from the house fire grew brighter as they went, and the heat started to intensify. When they reached the street the burning house was on, neighbors were outside, gawking in shock and horror. No one was doing a thing, and there were no sirens or lights in the distance. What are you doing? John yelled at the people nearest him. Get your hoses. Put water on that house. People stared at him, clearly dumbfounded that some stranger was yelling at them while their neighbor's house burned. John heard a scream from one of the upper floors of the burning home. You three, John indicated Todd and the other two. Get these people organized. We need water on that house, as many hoses as you can get. Use a couple to wet down the houses next to it. Todd caught on right away and moved before John stopped talking. The other two were close behind. They pushed and shouted, startling people out of their stupor. John went to the nearest house and turned on the outside faucet. It wasn't attached to a hose and started pouring water onto the ground at his feet. He stripped off his jacket and shirt, getting both of them soaking wet. After wringing water out over his head and soaking the rest of him, he put the jacket back on and tied the shirt around his face and neck. It only took a couple moments, but to John it was too long. The screams for help were desperately tugging at him to hurry. John, what are you doing? Todd asked when he saw his soaking friend heading for the inferno. Help isn't coming for a while. Someone has to go in for them, John said. He didn't stop, so Todd walked with him. I'm going to take out... I'm actually going to make this. Then we're going to take this out. And we're going to make that a new sentence. Help isn't coming for a while. We're going to make that up. Someone has to go in for them. He didn't stop, so Todd walked with him. Todd and the others had organized the neighbors, and everyone with a hose they could reach was working on getting them attached to faucets and pulled toward the burning house. Let me go, Todd said. John looked into his eyes as they walked. Todd was serious. He'd gladly walk into that house if John let him. John just shook his head. No time, John said, indicating his wet clothes. They'd gotten close to the house, and the heat made Todd stop. Even with the wet shirt, the inferno took John's breath away. Most of the backside of the house and the roof was aflame, and the air was scorching. The water covering John's clothes and hair made it bearable, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Amanda's going to kill you for this, Todd said, and me for letting you do it. Tell her I love her. John shouted back over his shoulder. John didn't hear if Todd said anything else. Climbing the steps of the porch, the roar of the fire engulfed every other sound. He couldn't even hear the screams anymore, and he prayed it was because the fire was too loud. He pulled his hand into his sleeve and tried the handle of the front door with the wet material protecting his hand. It steamed, but the door opened without burning his fingers. John stepped inside just as the first hose started pouring water into the roof above. Inside, the house was simple, like thousands of others in the Midwest. He was in a large living room that would have been comfortable and homey except for the flames crawling up the walls near the front door. The back of the room was engulfed in flames, and they were starting toward the front of the house. He didn't see any stairs, and had a door on his right and a large open doorway to a kitchen that seemed to be the source of the conflagration. He stepped through the door to the right rather than risking the wall of flames in the kitchen. John found himself in a bedroom that was nearly untouched by the fire and in the rest of the house. Smoke was pouring through, and John crouched to avoid most of it. Like many of these older homes, all of the rooms in the main floor were connected with no hallways, and he saw a door at the back of the room to the other side of the bed. On the other side of the bed, like the last room, there was no no one here, so he went through the open door and into a large dining room. The dining room was nearly as bad as the kitchen, with flames dancing the walls and across the ceiling. The tendrils of destruction fascinated him for a moment, moving like living things along the old woodwork in the room. On John's left were the stairs, climbing into a dark, smoky second floor. He could hear the screams above the flames and see that what kept the residents trapped upstairs. The steps were clear, but the walls in the stairwell the steps were clear, but the walls in the stairwell. But on the walls in the stairwell, hungry little flames licked across the plaster. The fire moved like it had a mind. The fire moved like it had a mind of its own, working its way up the walls toward the second story. John pulled his steaming jacket up around his neck and rushed up the stairs before they became impassable. At the top of the stairs was a loft, and what he thought were two doorways. The smoke was so thick coming up the stairs he wasn't sure, but he could clearly hear the screaming coming from the room on his right. He used his sleeve to protect his hand again and turned the knob on the door. The door was stuck on the towel the occupants pushed under it to keep out the smoke, but he was able to force it open with his body. The bedroom beyond was miraculously free of fire and had much less smoke in the air than the rest of the house. A woman and two children were huddled near an open window on the far side of the room, trying to get clean air. John remembered from being outside that window was too high off the ground to jump. It was at least 15 feet. It was at least a 15-foot drop straight down. "Come on, we need to get you out of here," John shouted at them from the door. The three turned, and John was relieved that she didn't hesitate. That the woman doesn't hesitate. She picked up the smaller of the two children and pushed the other in his direction. He could tell she was terrified, but the fact that he came through the house must have reassured her they could make it back out the same way. He pulled off his damp jacket and handed it to the woman. "Here, cover the both of you with this." He didn't wait to see if she did it. He untied the shirt that protected his face and draped it over the little girl's head before picking her up. He turned to the stairs and rushed down two at a time, praying the woman was following close behind. There was no time to be sure, so he did his best not to lose his way as he got the little girl out of her burning home. By some miracle, the path he'd used to enter the house was still relatively clear, and he rushed out the front door moments after having picked up the child. He turned to look back and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the woman and second child right behind him. The deep breath caused a coughing fit that racked his body and felt like his lungs were being torn apart. He set the child down before he dropped her. The scene outside was chaos as neighbors tried to get as much water as they could on the burning house and those next door. Some moved forward to help the woman and her children, and others were helping find more hose, buckets, and anything else that could hold water. John had seen Todd holding Amanda, who had obviously come to see what was happening after directing the other groups on their way. When John collapsed in the yard, Todd couldn't hold her back any longer. John felt her arms wrap around him while he knelt in the wet grass. She held him until the coughing subsided and he was able to stand. The look on her face shifted from horror to anger to something John could only interpret as pride. She didn't say anything, and he didn't prompt her for words. She just looked at his face as if studying it for the first and last time, like she hadn't expected to see him again. The moment was broken by the sound of sirens cutting through the night over the roar of the flames. John and the others didn't speak. They just turned to leave. The woman, whose house was slowly falling to a smoking ruin, rushed over before they crossed the street. She touched John's shoulder, and he turned to find himself suddenly wrapped in a vice-like embrace. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for saving my babies," the woman was sobbing. John gently detached himself from her and looked down at the woman. "Don't thank me. I just did what had to be done," John said. The woman looked at him as if he were crazy for a moment, but just nodded, unsure how to respond to that. John gave her a sooty smile. "If you want to thank someone, thank God. He's why we're passing by." "You're an angel, then?" the woman asked. "What's your name?" "No angel, just John," he said, giving her hand a squeeze. He took Amanda's arm, and together they turned and walked across the street and into the shadow between the other houses. They were on their way toward the bridge before the emergency vehicles arrived. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that chapter for a minute. Give me like 2-3 minutes. You use the restroom, get a refill, give my voice just a touch of a break. I'll be right back. Oh, it's getting warm in here. Open that door again. The kids. All right, thank you for your patience. Got a little sip here. Oh, that's good. Okay, so that was a fairly intense chapter to write and to reread. I haven't read that since it's been a while. So yeah, I like that. I like the way that scene went. Something in my necklace is bugging the crap out of my neck. Sorry about that. All right, so chapter 35. The re-education camps started out as acclimation centers for people who didn't fit into the new America. It was an easy way to get rid of political dissidents or enemies of the government. After all, America wasn't some third world dictatorship. They couldn't be dragged out of their homes in the night and killed. Eventually, it was a place to send people who hadn't actually committed a crime. They just needed a reminder of how to be good citizens. I never knew anyone that came back from a camp. The way I understood it was if you went to a camp, you were relocated after release. Of course, that always led to rumors that no one was ever released. Excerpt from the Journal of Don Everman. Okay, what time is it? All right. Lieutenant Casey left the border post with a stuffed bear and the knowledge that several of the fugitives were well out of his reach. The children had been the most important ones to capture. They tended to be easier to educate when separated from their parents. Now they were over the border, and he had no idea where the parents would be. He needed a plan and time to think. He remembered signs for a town, Neosho, east of the border post. He turned his SUV onto the road leading to the small town. With his new information, he might be able to requisition a helicopter to help with the search. He doubted it. Helicopters were expensive and very, very conspicuous, but he would try. His bosses would have to weigh the cost against the loss of a few citizens. They would also have to factor in how hard it would be to hide what was going on if it turned into a full-scale manhunt. He pulled into the town and easily found a motel with a diner. He hadn't slept the night before, and no matter how good his plan, he wouldn't get much done without a couple hours of rest. Like every establishment in the country, Casey only had to show his citizen's debit card, and he was given a meal and a room. The meal wasn't anything special, and Casey paid little attention to it. It was flavorless but nutritious, which was all that was required by the FDA. The diner was nearly empty. The diner, was nearly empty, except for a couple of elderly men who had the look of patrons that spent most of their day in the diner drinking the weak coffee. There was one bored-looking waitress in a wrinkled uniform, and the television was on the federal news station, which was regulation. Casey was glad to have some normalcy around him for a change. It helped him relax. While he ate, he called into the Peoria office on his cell phone. The reception was awful as usual, but like Casey's dad always said, you get what you pay for. Technically, these phones weren't paid for, but if they had been, they would be cheap. They'd be cheap. The desk sergeant picked up, and Casey asked to be transferred to the duty officer. Lieutenant? The voice on the other end sounded surprised. Simons. Casey recognized the voice of his subordinate. I need a team to come down to post 111 and pick up our van. Yes, sir. I'll send a team right away. How's the search for that missing girl? Casey asked. They're still looking, sir. Casey cursed under his breath. That would make resources scarce for his case. I need you to call Central. Ask for Harbaugh. He owes me a favor, Casey said. Tell him I'm asking for one helicopter to find these fugitives. I'll see what I can do, sir, Simons said. Good. I'll call back after I get some sleep. Sir, what about the prisoner? Simons asked. Casey had almost put Benny out of his mind. Of course, he had called everything in before heading down there, so they would be expecting a prisoner pickup as well as the vehicle retrieval. Casey just didn't see the point in putting Benny in prison or a camp. The bearded man had nothing to lose, nor did they have leverage they could hold over him. He wouldn't change or even become a productive member of society. He would just be a drain on the state. Casey couldn't see the benefit in incarcerating one man for the rest of his life when the goal was to reform them and get them back into society. There won't be a prisoner pickup, Casey said. They would want an explanation. He wasn't who I was looking for. Hakimi, hi. Yeah, so on Thursdays, this is actually my novel. I decided I was going to have to do another round of editing because I may have to self-publish this one. And I had gotten this idea from another author a couple years ago at a convention I went to where he got a lot of feedback actually writing a novel on a stream, and he was getting audience feedback, things like that. And I decided to sort of take that idea and modify it as an editing. So this is sort of an interactive audiobook. I'm editing as I go, and yeah, sort of reading the story. So it's sort of like an audiobook that you guys sort of get to see me go through the process of editing and changing some of the story and making it fit what I needed to fit. And yeah, so far I've had a few people stop in and people show some interest. So glad you stopped by. And yeah, I know it's an odd thing to stream, so I don't know. It's fun, and it actually makes me sit down and do this editing, which is one of the more tedious parts of writing. Editing is no fun for anybody. So this makes me do it because now I have a scheduled day when I have to sit down for 2 hours and do this. So hopefully people get some fun out of it, and I'll actually share you can read the book online too. I've got it on a site, the entirety of it, so I'll share that link on my Twitter feed too when I'm done with this, and you'd be able to read it if you wanted to, or read ahead, or watch the past episodes. But so yeah, that's what we're doing. Casey hated to lie, especially when it was about work, but he couldn't afford to be recalled to explain his decision. He would report the truth when he debriefed and faced the consequences then. Understood, Simon said. I'll try to get an answer for you today. Good, I'll call you later. Casey hung up the phone and finished his meal. Casey knew his chances of getting real help were slim. His bosses wanted the fugitives stopped, but not badly enough that they wanted to risk drawing attention to the situation. He knew they would rather see the people escape rather than a firestorm of public sympathy. At least if they left the country, the media out of Texas would be controlled through the jamming stations. I guess I should say, too, this is set in the not-too-distant future. It's a political dystopian book. and it's about a group of people that are leaving, that are running away from an America that has changed to the few states that didn't. Like, there were a few states that seceded, formed the Republic of Texas, and these people are running there to try to get away from a very oppressive government. And this guy, Casey, is trying to stop them. You look to be chewing on something pretty serious there, son. One of the elderly men sat down across from him. Casey looked up from his meal, knowing the man wasn't talking about the food. It's a private matter, citizen, Casey said. Bah, you can stuff all that comrade citizen talk. Name's Gordon. Gordon didn't hold out his hand. He just sat there looking at Casey. Casey knew exactly what he was dealing with now. The man was a silent dissenter. They were people who didn't agree with the way of things. They just kept to themselves and weren't considered much of a threat. For the most part, they were left alone unless they moved beyond the idle comment or two. Casey thought they were cowards. At least John and his people were doing something, as wrong as it was. Gordon, it's an official matter. I can't discuss it. Casey put his head down and started eating again. He hoped Gordon would take the hint. If you want my advice, son, Casey sighed, put your badge in the nearest dumpster and get yourself over to Texas. They need people like you there. Why do you say that, Gordon? Well, it's the weekend, and here you are, obviously miles from home, and you're working a case. If I had to guess, I'd say you're alone because everyone else put in their time for the week. Gordon nodded, but not really needing an answer. Casey didn't like how easily a stranger could read him. That was his job, after all. He thought about it and realized it probably wasn't that hard for someone who had been around long enough. Let's make that a contraction there. Who'd been around long enough. The plates on his SUV weren't local, and if that wasn't enough, the vehicle was covered in bugs and dust from a long drive. His uniform was wrinkled and needed washed, and he must not look all that orderly himself. It was the weekend, when almost every command officer in the country would be at home, leaving the work to the off-shift officers. Way I see it, Gordon kept talking, you are so focused on whatever it is you're looking for that you can't bring yourself to stick to your contract. You're wasting your talent. I have a duty. I took an oath to hold to that, Casey said. Gordon touched the side of his nose and smiled knowingly. He finished the dregs of the coffee in his little cup and stood up. Gordon, why aren't you headed there yourself? Casey asked. The old man stopped and turned back. I'm too old and set in my ways to be any use over there, Gordon said. Though the way he spoke about it was like he was talking about some fabled city of gold, or the outdated idea of heaven. Was a time I thought about it, but I waited too long. Gordon nodded at Casey when he said that last part. Gordon went back to his table with the other old man and sat down. The waitress came by and refilled both men's coffee, and they went back to their conversation as if the last few minutes never happened. Whether Casey knew it or not then, those few minutes would stay with him forever. In that moment, the conversation bothered Casey so much he couldn't concentrate on the problem of the fugitives. Even the tasteless meal, which was normally acceptable to Casey, seemed to turn his stomach. He decided it was exhaustion finally setting in, and sleep moved to the top of his priority list. The motel room was as sparse as the meal. The decor was identical to every other roadside establishment since about 1980, and smelled like it hadn't been aired out in as long. There was one double bed, a chair next to a small table, and a television on the dresser. The bathroom was no bigger than a closet, but it had a shower, so it would serve Casey's needs. He dropped his duffel, containing the much-needed change of clothes, into the chair and climbed into the cramped shower. Finally clean, after the lukewarm shower, exhaustion truly set in. Casey dried off, flipped on the national news, and collapsed onto the bed. They were covering the missing girl and all the steps the federal police were taking to find her. Casey didn't make it through 10 minutes of the story before he was asleep. Hours later, he woke with a start, and it took him several seconds to break through the fog of sleep and remember where he was. It came back to him piece by piece, and he sat up and looked at the television. It was later than he wanted to have slept. Cursing his failure to set an alarm, he grabbed his phone and called the Peoria office. Simons is out, sir, but he left a message for you, the desk officer said after Casey asked for the junior officer. Give it to me, Casey said. It says the chopper is a no-go and Central would like a briefing on the prisoner at your earliest convenience. The desk officer read the message. Of course they do, Casey grumbled. Can I help you with anything else, sir? Anything else, sir? No, thanks, Casey said, and hung up the phone. Tossed it back in the nightstand and rubbed at his face. He started to get up when the television switched over to local news. The lead story was an old house fire in Columbia, Missouri. He walked toward the bathroom but stopped. Columbia was in the fugitive's path. The timing was about right. He looked back at the television. The homeowner, Nancy Simmons, claims a stranger saved her family from the flames, the reporter was saying. The screen behind her showed a smoking hulk where a house had been. A fire truck and a federal patrol car were on the street, and neighbors stood around in robes and pajamas. A reporter on scene approached a woman sitting on the back of a fire truck, receiving oxygen while 2 children clung to her. I swear it was a miracle, the woman said when the microphone was put in front of her. She coughed and continued. It came out of nowhere, definitely not from around here. John's a hero, the woman finished. Where did this hero, John, go? The local reporter asked. He just walked away, with 4 others, right into the night, she said, pointing across the street. Casey didn't hear the reporter's next question, or Nancy's answer. He rushed to get dressed and collect his things. He stuffed everything into the duffel and was racing toward the motel stairs in a matter of moments. He had been in such a hurry he forgot to switch off the television or close the door behind him. All right. So that's that. Casey's back on the trail of the fugitives. John's act of kindness has alerted the authorities to where they are and given Casey another lead, which isn't good, but he saved a family from a burning building, so that's kind of good. So each chapter at Gamey starts with an excerpt from John's journal, and I use these to sort of give a backstory of this world that I've created and show how things have gotten to where they are and John's perspective on those things, because these are John's words. To sort of set the stage, when I created this world, I had been for a lot of years, I'd been listening to political pundits and people who were on talk shows and yelling heads and all of these other people, and I sort of started to catch on that there were some people out there with some really bizarre ideas, some really crazy ideas, but thankfully they were a very small group of people that didn't have a lot of power, and I wondered what would it be like, what would our world be like if those people did have enough power to make the changes they wanted to make? What would our world look like, and what would people do about it? For example, there's a recording, the FBI has a recording of the Weather Underground from the 1970s, which I don't know if you're old enough to know who they were, but the Weather Underground were a group of political dissidents that turned terrorist. I mean, they actually bombed buildings and they talked about killing people, and they were pretty awful. But this FBI agent recorded one of their meetings, and one of the people in this meeting said, the only way you could change America, the only way you could really change America is if you killed, like, I think he said, if you killed 25% of the population and put half the population in re-education camps. Now, some of the people that were in the Weather Underground are political advisors now. They're professors at colleges. So those are people with super crazy ideas, but thankfully not enough power to actually put them in place. But what would happen if they did? What would happen if the guy that talked about putting sterilants in the drinking water had enough power to get people behind him on that? What if the people that talked about eugenics, what if those really crazy people in America actually had enough power to make those changes? What would the world look like? And then what would people who live in that world, how would they react to it? And so I decided to create that world and write a story about how I think some people would react. And that's sort of where we are. We're at a group of people that decided they'd had enough, and they decided to leave. And the government can't have people leaving. Anytime you have a tyrannical government, in an information age, the government has to control the information. Otherwise, other people will get these ideas and take off and do crazy things. And when you live in a society that is dependent on all of its people fitting into a certain regimen, you can't lose anybody, because then you lose the key spokes in those little gears and wheels that you need to get things done, because nobody's motivated by being paid in this world. Nobody's motivated by getting ahead. So when you have people just sort of stop doing what they're supposed to be doing, it brings the whole system to a halt. So you can't have people just running off. That's why Casey's trying to stop them. All right, so chapter 36. Whether it was planned or not, the catastrophic breakdown of the welfare system early in the president's second term. Now, the president, I just refer to him as the president because I did not want this set in a particular time period or a particular, I didn't want a particular party or ideology be responsible for what's happened here. This is a very vague reference to any political party that's too progressive or too against the constitutional restrictions that our government currently has. So I just referred to them as the president. At some point in the past, the president gave himself lifetime powers. There was an emergency. He gave himself lifetime powers, never gave the powers back, and there was never any other election, and he became a tyrant. That's sort of why they refer to him this way. So early in the president's second term, let me start that over because it's not going to make sense. Whether it was planned or not, the catastrophic breakdown of the welfare system early in the president's second term, we don't need a comma there, became justification for many of the changes in the country. Between the two great wars, Roosevelt started the welfare system that became so prominent in this country. The original plan was to assist widows, children, and the elderly who had lived longer than the normal life expectancy. Over the years, political promises and crusader deals, good Lord, I can't talk today. Over the years, I do think we need a comma there. Political promises and crusader ideals had expanded the system to include just about anyone who was down on their luck. The trouble was the more people on welfare meant less people working, and the working people were the ones funding it. Eventually you reached a point where the balance tips, and there wasn't enough people working to pay for those who aren't. That's what happened to us. The system fell right off the cliff. People demanded a solution, and rightly so. The government had promised to take care of them, and suddenly it couldn't afford to. All of the other funds had been tapped out, all other programs borrowed from until there wasn't anything left. Just one of the symptoms of the perfect storm that led to what we see today. So that's sort of, and some of that's real. Like some of that is really, that's sort of a worst case scenario based on some of the stuff that's actually happening. A lot of government programs are being borrowed from to pay for others, and the government is in so much debt that at some point there's going to come a time where, oh, my laptop just went to sleep. I think because the mixer stream, 1 second here, paused. Oh, password. There we go. Let me refresh. No, go away. Refresh the mixer stream. So at some point, oh, it looks like the mix, yeah, there it is. Okay, so at some point, you're not going to have enough money going into the system to pay for all of this, and there's not going to be any left to borrow from. And somewhere there's going to be a breakdown, and that's one of the fears that a lot of people have with these programs that the elderly people rely on for Medicare, and people who aren't working rely on for unemployment, or people who are down on their luck. They rely on these systems that have been put in place and have been in place for so long, and eventually they're going to break down at the rate we're going. And that's a very valid fear, and this is sort of like the most extreme example of what could happen and what it could lead to. You know, if those systems broke down, it would be catastrophic, and the government would have to do something, and what they could and would do may be very drastic, maybe extremely drastic, and it might not be good for everyone. All right, the sun was starting to rise over the river the refugees had crossed the night before. The ripples in the water flashed silver as John watched from the edge of the wooded area they slept in. He was the only one awake, watching the colors of the world change with the coming day. Everyone was asleep. Now I contradict myself here. Here's why I'm doing this, so that I can edit this. So I say he's the only one awake, and then everyone's asleep behind him except for Todd. Someone watched from the edge of the slept in. I need to change something because I think we're just going to take this out. He watched. Let's see how this works. So the ripples of the water flashed silver as John watched from the edge of the. Yeah, see, I'm going to say watch twice there. Ripples in the water flashed silver as John watched the colors of the world change. I think we're going to take this out and put it here. Then we're going to take this out and see how that sounds. The ripples in the water flashed silver as John watched the colors of the world change with the coming day. Everyone was asleep behind him except for Todd, who shared the last watch. The other man was stretching his legs, walking along the tree line, but still within sight of his friend. That sounds a lot better. That's a much better sentence. Okay. The night before, the refugees had all met just... We need a comma there. It's not the night before they met. The night before... The refugees had all met just south of the highway, on the west side of the bridge as instructed. They'd waited anxiously for the ones who stayed behind to fight the fire, relieved to see him and the others finally cross the bridge. John's head count, when he got there, confirmed everyone made it through. Despite their exhaustion, John led them south for another hour to ensure no one would stumble upon them by accident. Sun's been up a while. Todd came back and sat down next to John and nodded toward the sleepers. Let them sleep a little longer. They've earned it. John coughed a little. His throat was still irritated from the smoke, and his voice was raspy. How are you feeling? Todd asked. How are you feeling? Yeah, that works. Everyone was concerned the smoke John had inhaled was concerned. That doesn't make sense. Everyone was concerned the smoke John had inhaled, but Todd's worry also carried a note of guilt. Everyone was concerned about the smoke John had inhaled, but Todd's worry also carried... I don't need also there. There we go. Todd's worry carried a note of guilt. Perfect. Sounds good. I'll be fine, Todd. John patted his friend on the shoulder and smiled. Remember, we have someone looking out for us. I don't think Amanda will ever forgive me for letting you go in there, Todd said. Todd, you couldn't have stopped me. She doesn't blame you. It was true, despite Todd's doubt. Amanda had been upset about John's stunt, but she didn't blame Todd. She reserved her anger for her husband. She was proud of him for rescuing the family from the burning house, but furious and terrified at the same time. John understood her conflicting emotions about it and sympathized. By the time the sun was fully up, everyone was awake and packing. They all ate and collected any stray garbage around the site as usual. Within 2 hours of sunrise, the refugees were split into their groups and ready to move. With John's group in the lead, they started walking south across old fields and woodland. More leaves had fallen within the previous night's wind, and they crunched underfoot like piles of potato chips. After a couple hours' walk, they reached an old road that traveled south. The pavement was broken, but not so bad it couldn't be walked on, but wouldn't be passable for a car. I don't like that sentence either. Let's see here. Pavement was broken, but not so bad it couldn't be walked on. Yeah, that's a terrible sentence. The pavement was broken, and impassable for a car, but it could be walked on. The pavement was broken and impassable for a car, but it could be walked on. That'll work. What do you think? Todd nodded toward the road. I don't think it's been used in years, but it would be faster than crossing these fields, John said. John looked at the broken pavement and weeds growing in the cracks. He decided it was worth the risk to save some time. He checked the map, but the old highway wasn't on it. It was probably part of a network of old farm roads between the interstates. He guessed they could follow it south to the next major road and eventually the interstate they would use to guide them west. We should be able to follow this to California, John said, tracing the route on the map with his finger. We'll go around the town and stay on this until we're... I should probably clarify, because people from the area don't know that California is a town in Missouri. To the town of California. We'll go around the town and stay on this until we're a couple hours south of it. That works. Okay. Looks pretty small. Shouldn't be too much trouble, Todd said, looking at the map over John's shoulder. The group set off again on the old highway, moving steadily south. It was easier going than the open ground they were used to. As long as they watched for broken chunks of the road and large cracks, they made good time. John was struck by how quiet it was along that stretch of road. Of course there were sounds of wildlife, but they were used to hearing the sounds of the occasional car on a nearby road or farm and construction machinery in the distance. The only farms they passed were abandoned years before, and the further south they traveled, the more decayed the road was. They reached the outskirts of California, Missouri, late in the afternoon. John opened the map, looking for an old farm road he had seen before. Here it is. We'll take this road around and meet up with the interstate. John was tracing the line on the map. That will take us back to 87. John, wait. Todd was standing a few feet ahead, looking toward the town with his head tilted like he was concentrating on a sound he couldn't quite hear. What is it? What do you hear? John asked, moving closer to his friend. That's just it, John. Nothing. I don't hear any cars, children playing, machinery, nothing, Todd said. While it's true that fewer cars and fewer people meant towns were quieter, it was still shocking to hear nothing but silence this close to a town the size of California. All the sounds of human habitation tend to blend into a miasma of unidentifiable noise unless one is close enough to a specific source to hear it. Even outside the town, there should have been a steady drone of sounds, punctuated by the occasional car horn, children at play, or a lawnmower. Standing on the outskirts of California, Missouri, the sound of silence was deafening. Tell everyone to wait here. Todd and I are going to have a look, John said to Amanda. He started to turn away. John, Amanda's voice was stern, and he turned back. Don't do anything reckless. John smiled and stepped closer to kiss her on the forehead. Don't worry, dear. We're just going to have a look. I doubt there are any burning buildings to run into this time. Amanda didn't smile at his joke, but she nodded, giving his hand a squeeze. They both knew if doing the right thing required reckless action, John wouldn't think twice about doing it. It was part of the reason she loved him. It was also the reason she was always worried when he went off on his own. She just did what she always did and prayed God kept him safe. When John and Todd walked between the first couple of houses, they noticed the overgrown yards and deteriorated buildings. That wasn't an uncommon sight in the smaller towns of the Midwest, as populations were moved and contracted toward the center of towns. Some yards had rusting cars, bicycles, and toys buried under the weight of nature taking back what was hers. They stuck to the streets, which were as cracked and broken as the highway had been, to avoid the dangers of the long grass. The refugees had been lucky so far, but they were always conscious of the danger of snake bites, so far from help. As they moved toward the center of town, it became apparent why they were hearing nothing from the highway. There was nothing to hear. Even in the center of town, where they expected to see the concentrated population of California, they found only a decaying shell. Broken glass littered the crumbling streets and sidewalks, mixed with bits of concrete, asphalt, and bricks from the streets and buildings. Grass grew in the street across walkways, and anywhere else it could find a hold in the man-made landscape. Abandoned? Abandoned, Todd said simply, looking around at the empty buildings. They had both heard of towns left to rot when they had nothing to offer. Their citizens moved to other towns and cities to be reassigned to work that would support society. Neither of them had seen it with their own eyes. John couldn't help but feel sadness creep over him at the sight. Empty and broken storefronts where people had built their dreams were staring at... Hold on a second. Stumbling over words because I need a drink. All right. Where was I? Empty and broken storefronts where people had built their dreams were staring out at the deserted street like the hollow sockets of a skull. Where a town at night just felt asleep, California felt dead. Let's head back, John said. There's no need to go around. Todd nodded, and they turned around and headed back. John didn't like the feeling of the ghost town, and he hoped to move everyone through it as quickly as possible. With the broken roads radiating out from the decaying town, it reminded him of a cancer, of a place of rot in the middle of America. How many such wounds marred the once great country, he thought. How many abandoned yards where children once played, or homes where families once lived. At what point did Americans go from a people who defended their homes, neighbors, and towns with their very lives to nothing but cattle to be moved wherever it suits the whim of the government? At least there was evidence that nature would eventually retake what was hers. Okay, so we've got not enough time to do another chapter. I'm going to mark this one. All right, so in a few minutes, I'm going to share a link on Twitter so where you can go read this book if you want to, bearing in mind that it is an unedited version. I've been making edits as we've gone through the first, what are we on, 6 episodes. So 5 episodes before this. If you rather would hear me read it, go to the Frags and Beer Network and watch the first 5 episodes, starting with episode 1. Come back. I usually do this every other week because on Thursday nights I have something that happens every other week that I do. So it'll either be this or that. Saturday we're going back to, I believe, Shattered, our Fallout 4 story on Saturday Randomness, and more Baldur's Gate 2 next Monday on Monday Night Classics. So thank you guys for joining me. Thank you, Akimi, for coming to the stream. I appreciate it, watching live. Anybody who is watching the recording, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share. If you found this interesting, or if you have suggestions, like you have questions about writing or editing or anything, let me know. You can find my 2 short stories that are published and available on Amazon. Actually, one is more like a novella and the other one's a short story. They're both on Amazon. Check my pinned tweet on Twitter. And I should have a 3rd one coming soon once I get the cover artist and the editing done for the 3rd part of that series. That will also be put up there. You too, Akimi, have a great day. We will see you again next time. And as usual, thank you so much. You guys have a great one. I'll see you next time. Much love.